I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you are tasked with running a sovereign nation.
Okay, no pressure.
Right, no pressure at all.
Yeah,
You are sitting at the executive desk. But, there is a catch.
there's always a catch.
Yeah, a massive, catastrophic, structural catch. You have to run this nation using two completely contradictory constitutions at the exact same time.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like a nightmare.
It really is. So on the left side of your desk, you have a constitution outlining a strict egalitarian system. The law is objective, transparent, and it applies equally to every single citizen without exception.
Right. A perfectly horizontal legal framework.
Exactly. But on the right side of your desk, you have a constitution for an absolute autocracy where the whims, the moods, and, the personal interests of a single ruling class basically dictate reality.
So you're trying to blend those two things together.
Yes. Now think about what actually happens if you try to govern your society by blending these two documents. It wouldn't just be like a minor bureaucratic headache.
Oh, definitely not. The whole thing would shatter.
Right. The police wouldn't know who to arrest. The judges wouldn't know how to rule. The economy would just fracture. You would instantly create a society that tears itself apart from the inside out.
Because you've institutionalized a literal paradox.
Exactly.
It is the textbook definition of systemic collapse. I mean, you cannot have two ultimate authorities in a single system. In any functional framework, whether it's like a computer operating system or a human civilization, if the foundational code is contradictory, the system crashes.
It crashes.
It is a structural impossibility to serve two opposing laws simultaneously.
And that impossible, chaotic scenario of the two constitutions is exactly how our source material today frames one of the most, misunderstood, heavily debated concepts in ancient history.
Yeah, this is where the text gets incredibly radical.
It really does. So in this deep dive, we are unpacking a lecture delivered by the philosopher and scholar Allama Parvez back in 1981. He's focusing on a specific section of the Quran, Surah Ghafir, specifically verses 10 through 27. And here is where Parvez completely flips the table on conventional thinking. He takes this ancient concept of shirk, which, for centuries has been almost universally translated as polytheism or idol worship, and he completely strips away the supernatural theological framing.
Entirely. He removes all the mysticism from it.
He really does. He argues that this concept fundamentally has nothing to do with, people bowing down to stone statues in the desert. Instead, he presents it as a socioeconomic disaster.
Yes, which is such a fascinating pivot.
Right. He defines it literally as political treason against a constitutional framework.
It's a huge redefinition, and especially when you consider the historical context of 1981, you really have to remember the global landscape at that time.
Right. What was going on globally?
Well, you have the Cold War, you have military dictatorships consolidating power all across the developing world, and you also have the rise of political movements that are heavily leveraging religious dogma to justify state control.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's the backdrop.
Exactly. Into this highly charged environment, Parvez drops this purely rationalist critique. He is asserting that human societies fundamentally break down when authority is divided.
Meaning when you introduce that second constitution.
Exactly. The text posits that the ultimate rational societal order relies on a single, unified, objective law, a framework where no human being rules arbitrarily over another human being.
Okay.
So when you mix that universal, equitable constitutional law with arbitrary human-made laws specifically designed to let one group dominate another, you are committing this act of treason.
You are introducing the autocracy constitution on the right side of the desk.
Right. You are poisoning the system.
Okay, let's make sure we really grasp the mechanics of this because it shifts the entire paradigm. The lecture explicitly states that if you live in a state, your relationship to that state and, to your fellow citizens is entirely dictated by its constitution. If you bring a second constitution into that state, you aren't just a dissenting voice. You are committing rebellion. You are attempting to overthrow the equity of the system.
Right, because you're attacking the objective law.
Exactly. Parvez says, in this framework, the divine law is not some mystical set of rituals. It is the ultimate objective constitution. It's not about, chanting that the creator is one or closing your eyes and meditating on a singular deity.
No, it's highly practical.
It is about pure, unadulterated obedience to an objective law that ensures socioeconomic equity. The moment you say, well, we will follow this universal law for some things, but for other things like our economy or our justice system, we will follow the laws made by this billionaire or this political dictator, you have poisoned the well.
Precisely. And he emphasizes that this isn't an abstract theoretical problem that only theologians should care about. It's a highly visible structural disease.
A structural disease. I like that phrasing.
Yeah, because anytime you elevate human-made subjective authority to the level of objective constitutional law, you inevitably create a hierarchy of oppression. You create a system where the law bends to the powerful.
Which we see all the time.
All the time. The source material argues that this mixing of authorities, this treason, is the root cause of all societal decay. It's not classified as a crime because it offends a deity's ego, right?
Right.
It's classified as a crime because it physically, economically, and structurally destroys the equity of the society. You're authorizing human beings to exploit other human beings under the guise of law.
Okay, so if mixing flawed human laws with universal constitutional laws inevitably breaks a society, we really need to understand the actual mechanism of how that society and, like, the individuals within it decays.
You need to look at the symptoms.
Exactly. If this is a disease, what are the symptoms and how does the virus replicate? Because you can't just say society collapses without explaining the machinery of that collapse.
Right. And the source material actually provides a very specific mechanism for this decay, which it calls the law of cause and effect, or Makafari-Yamal. Yeah. And to explain how inescapable this law is, Parwez uses a deeply evolutionary lens. He traces the concept of life all the way back to its origins to show that this law of cause and effect operates on every single level of existence, from the microscopic to the macro-political.
And this is where the text gets incredibly layered, because he references a concept laid out in this ancient text over 1,400 years ago, describing the origins of biological life.
Which is fascinating on its own.
It is. He notes that the text points to the first living cell, the very first spark of animate life emerging from the combination of inanimate water and sticky clay.
Right.
Now, when you look at modern evolutionary biology and abiogenesis, science essentially tracks this exact same starting point. Water, organic compounds, and inanimate earth, specifically clay minerals, which scientists now believe acted as a catalyst to form early RNA combining to create the first single-celled life.
It's an evolutionary sequence.
Exactly. It's perfectly rational.
And it is a crucial foundation for his entire socioeconomic argument, too, because he is establishing that the universe does not operate on magic. It operates on a continuous, rational process of evolution.
Okay, so no supernatural intervention here.
None. You move from an inanimate state, which he metaphorically calls a state of death, to an animate state, which is life.
Got it.
But, and this is the key point he makes, the evolution doesn't stop with biological life. Once you have a biologically living human being, a creature with consciousness and free will, the next phase of evolution isn't just physical.
We aren't just waiting to grow a third arm.
Exactly. The next phase is the evolution of the human self, the human personality, the psyche.
Wait, let me push back on this for a second, because that is a very clean, rational, almost secular-sounding evolutionary framework. But this source material is fundamentally an analysis of a religious text.
True.
So how does a purely rational cause and effect framework deal with concepts like hell or divine punishment?
That is the big question.
Because if I stop the average person on the street and say the word hell, they aren't thinking about the evolution of the human psyche. They're thinking about a supernatural fire pit, demons with pitchforks, Dante's Inferno, eternal physical torture.
Right, the traditional imagery.
Yeah. So if there is no magic here, how does a rational evolutionary theory account for hell?
That is exactly the friction Parwez is addressing. And his answer is just a total paradigm shift.
Yeah.
He completely redefines Jahannam, which is the traditional word translated as hell.
Okay, how does he define it?
Well, he argues vehemently that it is not a literal supernatural fire pit in some geographical afterlife. Instead, he points to the Arabic root word, jahim.
Jahim.
Yeah. And the root meaning of jahim is essentially a stoppage. It is a structural and psychological state where human evolutionary progress completely violently halts.
So stagnation.
Yeah.
Complete and total paralysis.
Total paralysis. Think back to that evolutionary ladder we just mapped out, from inanimate matter to biological life to the continuous upward development of the human self through constructive actions.
Right.
Hell, or jahim, is the sudden catastrophic stopping of that momentum. It is the deep, inescapable realization by an individual or an entire society that their destructive actions, their oppressive laws, their treason against the objective constitution have permanently stalled their own development.
Wow. The source material describes it as a state where there is neither life nor death. You are just stuck.
You're in limbo.
Yeah. And Parwez argues this state is actually worse than physical death because physical death is just a biological transition, right? The animate body returns to inanimate matter. The cycle continues.
It's natural.
But this stagnation of the self, this jahim, is an agonizing psychological paralysis. I mean, imagine the cognitive dissonance. You realize you have destroyed your own potential, you have caused misery to others, and you cannot move forward, but you also cannot just cease to exist.
You are trapped in the searing awareness of your own self-inflicted decay.
Exactly. It is a psychological burning, not a physical one.
And this ties perfectly back to Makafati Amal, the law of cause and effect. Every single action you take, every decision you make in relation to other human beings either builds up and strengthens yourself, propelling you forward on that evolutionary ladder, or it damages and weakens yourself, dragging you down toward that state of stagnation.
It's like a cosmic ledger.
Absolutely. But it's not a magical book kept by an invisible accountant. It is the actual observable state of your own psychology and the tangible reality of the society you are building. The punishment is baked right into the crime.
And this brings up a detail from the text that I found absolutely fascinating because it completely redefines how we think about justice.
Oh, the concept of intent.
Yes. When we look at human judicial systems, they are fundamentally reactive. A human court can only punish an action after it has been committed, right?
Right. You have to actually do the thing.
Right. If you sit in your living room and meticulously plan to embezzle millions of dollars from your company, you draw up the spreadsheets, you find the offshore accounts, but you never actually execute the transfer, the FBI cannot arrest you.
They can't do anything.
You haven't committed a crime under human law because human law requires an external victim.
That's correct. Human jurisprudence requires a tangible, visible violation of the established rules. It requires a material breach.
But this rational framework argues something much deeper. It argues that even the intent to commit a crime, just harboring that destructive thought, just desiring to exploit someone else, inflicts immediate, measurable psychological damage on you.
It's an internal rot.
Yeah. The source uses a philosophical parallel here, kind of akin to Nietzsche's idea. The crime you commit against society, well, society might eventually forgive, but the crime you commit against your own psyche by intending to do evil, who forgives that?
No one can. The damage is already done to your internal structure.
Exactly.
It is a profound insight into human psychology. Parwez is arguing that the law of cause and effect doesn't wait for the police report.
Right.
The very moment you formulate the intent to steal, to oppress, to exploit someone else for your own gain, you have initiated a destructive process within your own self. You have introduced a toxic variable into your own evolutionary development.
And human courts only see the visible actions, the things that are out in the open.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this universal law operates on the hidden things, the intentions, the internal state. Why? Because harboring malice requires you to rationalize inequality.
Oh, that's a great point.
It requires you to view another human being as a means to an end rather than an equal. That cognitive dissonance, knowing you are violating the objective law of equity but doing it anyway, it just rots your psychological foundation.
So to put it in modern terms, it's like a software virus. A human court can only punish you if you execute the malicious code and crash the servers. But Parwez is saying that the moment you write the malicious code and save it to your own hard drive, you have already corrupted your own operating system.
That is an excellent analogy.
Your system is now compromised whether you deploy the virus externally or not.
The rot starts internally.
But, if intent rots the individual from the inside out, what does that rot look like when it scales up?
That's where it gets really dangerous.
Right. What happens when the individuals harboring these intentions, the people who actively desire to dominate, hoard, and exploit, are the ones who maneuver themselves into power and build the political structures of an entire country?
This is the macro-political scale.
Yes. Because the source text makes a massive, terrifying pivot here. It takes this concept of individual psychological decay and scales it up to society. It introduces a specific, historically repeating, three-pronged system of oppression that guarantees a society will stagnate and enter that state of jahim.
The triad of oppression.
The triad.
And this is where Parwez turns to the historical confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, which is the absolute centerpiece of this section of Surah Ghafir.
But he reads it differently.
Completely differently. Again, he insists we must not read this through the lens of a Sunday school story. We aren't talking about a magical staff or parting a sea.
No Cecil B. DeMille stuff here.
Right. He demands we read this as a masterclass in political science and sociology. He presents this narrative as the ultimate political clash between the objective rule of law and a systemic triad of oppression.
I really want to spend some time breaking this down because it is chillingly relevant to how the modern world operates right now. The text uses 3 specific figures from the Moses narrative as archetypes for the 3 pillars that hold up any corrupt, stagnant society.
Let's look at the first pillar.
Okay.
The first pillar is political autocracy, represented by the archetype of Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh isn't just a bad king in this analysis.
What does he represent?
He represents the state apparatus when it claims absolute sovereignty. He acts as the supreme law. In the text, Pharaoh famously tells his people, "I am your supreme lord."
Which sounds theological.
It does, but Parwez clarifies that Pharaoh wasn't claiming to be the literal creator of the universe.
Yeah.
The people of Egypt had a whole pantheon of gods for that. What Pharaoh meant was, my word is the ultimate constitution. I am the supreme sovereign authority over your lives.
Ah, this is the pinnacle of the treason we discussed at the very beginning.
Exactly. Pharaoh has replaced objective universal law with his own arbitrary will.
Right, he is the guy sitting at the top of the pyramid, holding that contradictory constitution and violently forcing everyone to obey it. If you want to see this today, look at any political dictator, or even just an unaccountable executive branch that bypasses the legislature to rule by decree.
It's the exact same archetype.
But here's the thing about dictators. You can rarely hold power by brute military force alone for very long. If you just beat people over the head every day, eventually they figure out there are more of them than there are of you, and they rebel.
Right. Violence isn't sustainable on its own.
Exactly. So Pharaoh cannot sustain his power in a vacuum. He desperately needs the second pillar of the triad to keep the system stable.
And that vital second pillar is the religious or ideological establishment, represented in the text by a figure named Haman.
Haman.
Yeah. Haman represents the priesthood, the propagandists, the ideological manipulators. Their specific job in the oppressive system is to legitimize the dictator in the minds of the public.
So they are the PR department.
Essentially, yes. They use dogma, superstition, and manufactured narratives to keep the masses docile and compliant.
This is where the text just gets absolutely brutal in its critique. It describes this symbiotic dynamic perfectly. The dictator sits on the throne with the military, and the high priest, or today the state-sponsored media network, or even a toxic corporate HR department, stands next to him and tells the starving, exhausted masses, "Do not rebel against the king, for he is the shadow of God on earth."
Your suffering in this life is actually a test.
Exactly. To disobey the current power structure is to disobey the divine. It is the perfect racket.
It really is. The politician gets absolute unquestioned power, and the priest, the ideological establishment, gets a massive cut of the wealth and social influence in exchange for keeping the population brainwashed and pacified.
Wow.
It is the ultimate ideological control mechanism. Because if you can convince people that their systemic subjugation, their poverty, their lack of rights is actually divinely ordained, they won't demand a new constitution.
They won't fight back.
No, they won't demand their rights here and now. They will just passively pray for a better afterlife. And by neutralizing the threat of a popular uprising, Haman allows the third pillar of the triad to operate with absolute impunity.
Which brings us to the third pillar, capitalist exploitation, represented in the text by the figure of Karun, or Korah, as he's known in the biblical tradition.
Right.
Karun represents the hoarding of wealth, economic monopoly, and unchecked predatory capitalism. He is the oligarch. He is the billionaire class that buys the politicians.
So when you step back, you see the complete self-sustaining machinery of oppression.
The whole pyramid.
Yes. Pharaoh controls the state apparatus, the police, and the military. Haman controls the narrative, the beliefs, and the minds of the people. And Karun controls the land, the resources, and the economy.
Together, these 3 archetypes create a vertical, hierarchical society designed for one specific purpose: to funnel all wealth, power, and human dignity to the absolute top of the pyramid, while the masses at the bottom are ground into dust to keep the machine running.
It's a perfect encapsulation of systemic inequality.
And here's a specific observation from Parwez's analysis of the text that I found absolutely brilliant. because it proves what the elites are actually afraid of.
Okay, what's that?
Parwez points us to a specific scene described in Surah Ghafir. Pharaoh is holding a high-level cabinet meeting with his advisors. Presumably, Haman and Korun are there to deal with the Moses problem. Moses has been preaching this new message, and he is gaining traction.
Right.
Now, if this were genuinely just a religious dispute, you would expect Pharaoh to say, this Moses guy is preaching a false theology, he's insulting our sun god, he isn't performing the right rituals, we must execute him to defend our religion.
But that is not what Pharaoh says at all.
Not even clear.
The text is very explicit about his motivations.
Pharaoh stands up in his boardroom and explicitly states his true fear. He tells his cabinet, let me kill Moses because I fear that he will change your system or that he will cause political chaos in the land.
Yeah, political chaos.
The specific Arabic word used in the text is fasad, which translates to corruption, chaos, or political upheaval. Pharaoh doesn't care about theology. He doesn't care about what name Moses uses for God. He is terrified of a socioeconomic revolution.
It's a remarkable moment of political candor. I mean, Pharaoh correctly identifies the existential threat to his power. He knows that Moses isn't just bringing a new meditation technique or a new set of prayers.
Right.
Moses is bringing a new constitution. Moses is advocating for that universal objective law that says no human being has the right to dominate another.
And Pharaoh does the math instantly.
Instantly. If the people adopt that objective law, the entire triad collapses overnight. Pharaoh loses his political autocracy, Haman loses his religious monopoly, and Korun loses his hoarded exploitative wealth.
Pharaoh is essentially saying the quiet part out loud behind closed doors. He's saying, if we let this guy keep talking about objective justice and equity, our pyramid scheme is finished. It proves, right there in the text, that the conflict between Moses and Pharaoh is fundamentally structural, political, and economic. It's not supernatural. The elite are utilizing state violence to protect their exploitative supply chain.
And Parwez makes a profound point here. This triad didn't die in the sands of ancient Egypt.
Oh, definitely not.
The names change, but the architecture remains. This is a recurring fractal pattern throughout all of human history. Whenever you look at a society that is stagnating, whenever you see widespread misery, massive wealth inequality, and systemic injustice, if you look closely enough, you will almost always find some iteration of this exact triad operating behind the scenes.
Every single time.
You will find a political elite hoarding power, a media or ideological establishment justifying that power, and an economic elite hoarding the resources.
Which naturally forces us to ask the biggest, most crucial question of this whole deep dive. If Pharaoh's oppressive triad is the disease, if it is the structural rot that causes a society to stagnate and plunge into that state of Jahim, that living hell of halted evolution, what is the cure?
We need a solution.
Right. What is the specific, rational alternative that the source material offers? Because you can't just tear down the pyramid and leave a vacuum. If we dismantle Pharaoh's system, what exactly do we build in its place?
The source material does not leave us with a vacuum. It provides a very clear, meticulously structured positive model.
Okay, let's hear it.
It introduces a comprehensive socioeconomic system that it refers to as Deen.
Deen. And just like he did with Shirk and Jahannam, Parwez points out that mainstream tradition has completely neutralized and redefined this word.
Yes, they have.
If you ask most people today, they will translate the Arabic word deen simply as religion. But Parwez argues that is a massive, highly consequential mistranslation.
He clarifies that Deen does not mean religion in the Western sense of private spiritual beliefs. He specifically points to the term Yawmuddin.
Yawmuddin.
Now, Yawmuddin is a phrase famously recited by Muslims dozens of times a day in their prayers, and it is almost universally translated as the Day of Judgment, a supernatural apocalyptic event in the afterlife where God weighs your sins.
That's the standard understanding.
But Parwez fundamentally redefines it based on the root of Deen. He says Deen means a system of life, a system of law, a functional constitutional state.
Okay.
Therefore, Yawmuddin is not a supernatural event at the end of time. It is the ultimate societal goal in the here and now. It translates to the era, or the realization, of a perfectly equitable constitutional state on Earth.
Okay, so if Deen is the blueprint for an equitable state here and now, what is the core, non-negotiable rule of this system?
It has one foundational principle.
Right, and the text is incredibly explicit about this. The ultimate constitutional rule that anchors this entire alternative system is this. No human being shall have any authority or dominance over another human being. Let that sink in.
It's huge.
No human being has the right to rule over another.
I want to unpack the weight of that because it is the linchpin of the entire philosophy.
Right.
In the system of Deen, no human, no matter how rich, no matter how politically connected, no matter what their bloodline is, can exercise arbitrary authority over another citizen.
So no autocrats.
None. The only authority in the society is the objective, universal constitution itself. To use a specific phrase from Parvez's lecture, in this system, no one is allowed to be a debail.
A debail.
Yes, a debail is a subordinate, someone who is subjugated, someone who is forced by economic or political circumstance to live under the thumb of another person's arbitrary power.
But let me play devil's advocate here, because this sounds incredibly utopian on paper.
Sure.
If no human has authority over another human, how does this society actually function in the real world?
People always ask that.
Right. Who builds the roads? Who organizes the supply chains? Who runs the hospitals? Isn't some level of hierarchy biologically natural for humans? If we have a purely horizontal society, won't it just devolve into anarchy because no one is in charge?
That is the most common critique of egalitarian systems.
Yeah.
But the text makes a crucial distinction between administrative function and structural oppression.
Okay, clarify that.
A perfectly horizontal society does not mean there are no managers or no project leaders or no administrators. It means that the manager's authority is strictly limited to the objective rules of the job, and they have no arbitrary power over the worker's dignity, livelihood, or rights.
I see.
The hierarchy is purely functional and administrative. It's based on competence and law, not based on innate superiority or the ability to inflict harm. Think of it like traffic laws.
The traffic laws.
Yeah, the traffic light tells you when to stop and go. You obey the traffic light not because the light is intrinsically superior to you, but because you and all other drivers have mutually agreed to obey an objective system that prevents you from crashing into each other.
Right, you don't worship the traffic light.
Exactly. The system of Deen is a society governed by traffic lights, not by a king who arbitrarily decides who gets to drive and who gets run over.
That makes perfect sense. The authority resides in the law, not in the person executing the law.
Precisely.
And this brings us to the actual socioeconomic implications of the system. Because if no one has arbitrary authority over anyone else, exploitation becomes structurally impossible. And to explain this, the text discusses the concept of zulm.
Zulm, yes.
Now, zulm is usually translated as oppression, sin, or cruelty. But Parvez gives the literal Arabic root meaning of the word, which I found profound. He says zulm literally means a thing not being in its proper place.
A thing not being in its proper place. It is such a brilliant mechanical, structural definition of injustice.
It is, because it means that oppression isn't just about someone being mean to you or a king executing people in the town square. Oppression is an accounting error in the fabric of reality.
An accounting error, yeah.
Think about what zulm looks like today. The source's logic implies that when a factory worker works 60 hours a week, but the surplus value of their labor is captured by a CEO who uses it to buy a fourth yacht while the worker can't afford groceries, that wealth is not in its proper place.
Right, in the context of the text, that is zulm.
Exactly. When a politician uses gerrymandering to dilute the voting power of a specific demographic to maintain their own power, that political power is not in its proper place. That is also zulm.
It's all structural imbalance.
In the system of Deen, the goal is to eradicate zulm.
Yeah.
Every element of society, wealth, power, resources, is exactly where it rationally belongs based on objective equity.
Exactly. Meaning, no one's labor can be stolen or exploited, and conversely, no one receives wealth or status or power that they didn't personally earn through their own constructive labor.
So no free rides?
There are no free rides for the elite, and there is no systemic theft from the working class. The pharaohs, the political masters who demand blind obedience, are entirely removed from the equation.
Fine.
The Hamans, the ideological manipulators who try to trick you into accepting your own subjugation, are out of a job. And the Quruns, the hoarders of capital, are structurally prevented from monopolizing the resources.
If we contrast this with the world we live in, it requires a complete reimagining of how we relate to each other.
It really does.
We are so profoundly conditioned to live inside Pharaoh's vertical pyramid. We expect there to be a boss, a ruler, an elite class at the top, and layers upon layers of subordinates beneath them. We just sort of accept that some people are born to be crushed at the bottom.
It's normalized.
But the system of Deen proposes a perfectly horizontal network. You don't bow to anyone, and no one bows to you. You are all equally subject to an objective, transparent constitution that guarantees that whatever you put into the society, you get back in fair measure.
It is a society built entirely on mutual respect and the inviolable rule of law rather than the arbitrary rule of men.
But this raises the final, most practical dilemma.
The how do we get there dilemma.
Exactly. It is one thing to sit here and theorize about a perfectly horizontal, equitable society governed by objective law. It is another thing entirely to actually build it, especially when you and everyone you know are currently living inside Pharaoh's pyramid.
Right. It's not going to just happen on its own.
Because the people sitting comfortably at the top of that pyramid, the modern pharaohs, Hamons, and Korans, are not going to read this analysis and say, you know what, you're right. We should dismantle our monopolies and distribute power equally.
You know, they benefit massively from the Zulum.
They thrive on things not being in their proper place. They will use the military, the media, and the economy to crush any attempts to change the Constitution.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this entire analysis.
How do you get from an oppressive vertical pyramid to a free horizontal society? You can't just wait for it to happen organically. You need a catalyst.
You need action.
Someone has to actually stand up, look the dictator in the eye, and demand the change, knowing full well the risks involved.
And this is exactly where the source text introduces its final major archetype, the Mardi Momen, which translates to the believer.
Now, based on everything we've unpacked today, we have to throw out all our preconceived notions of what a believer is.
That's what.
The text makes it explicitly clear that this figure is not a passive, meditating ascetic sitting in a cave somewhere, detached from the suffering of the world.
Not at all. The text portrays the true believer as a highly active, incredibly courageous political revolutionary.
A revolutionary.
The culmination of Parwez's lecture focuses on a specific individual mentioned in the verses of Surah Ghafir. This individual is a member of Pharaoh's own court who secretly aligns with Moses' objective law.
Okay.
And when Pharaoh announces his plan to execute Moses to prevent the socio-economic revolution, this individual doesn't hide in the shadows. He doesn't just pray for a good outcome. He stands up directly inside Pharaoh's cabinet meeting, literally in the belly of the beast.
Right in the boardroom.
Surrounded by the absolute autocrat, the military generals, and the sycophants.
He literally crashes the boardroom.
Essentially, yes. And he boldly, rationally challenges the autocrat's oppressive system right to his face. He argues against the state-sponsored violence. He demands that they consider the rational, equitable alternative that Moses is presenting. Parwez points out that the Quran dedicates significant space to recording this man's speech and his logical arguments verbatim. Why? Because this action, this willingness to speak truth to absolute power, is the ultimate manifestation of human evolution in this framework.
It is the exact opposite of Jahim. It's
Exactly.
the opposite of psychological stagnation. It is the human self reaching its absolute highest potential. It is a human being exhibiting absolute courage, pure rationality, and an unshakable commitment to justice, even when facing the ultimate machinery of state oppression.
He isn't afraid of Pharaoh's human-made laws.
Or his threats of violence. Because his psychology is entirely aligned with the universal objective law.
The believer is the one who categorically refuses to commit treason against the universal constitution. He refuses to accept the premise that Pharaoh's arbitrary will has any legitimate authority over him or anyone else in society.
He rejects the premise entirely.
He acts as the vanguard of the horizontal society, actively working to dismantle the vertical pyramid from the inside out.
So, if we pull all of these threads together, what is this source text actually communicating to us?
It's a massive thesis.
It is presenting a complete, logically airtight, purely rational case for an economically just society. It completely discards the toxic idea that religion or divine law is about appeasing an angry deity through mindless rituals, while ignoring the very real suffering of the world around you.
It demands a constitutional system where authority belongs only to objective law.
Right.
It calls for the complete systemic eradication of the triad of oppression. No more political dictatorship, no more ideological manipulation to keep people docile, and no more economic exploitation of the working class.
It is a blueprint for human dignity. It says that your life, your labor, and your mind belong exclusively to you.
Entirely.
And any system, whether it's a government, a corporation, or a religious institution that tries to steal those things from you is not just unfair, it is structurally corrupt.
It's treason.
Yes, it is committing treason against the natural order, and it is doomed to collapse under the inescapable law of cause and effect.
And crucially, it places the responsibility for fixing this squarely on the individual.
You have to act.
You cannot outsource your evolution to a savior. You cannot just hope the pyramid falls down on its own due to structural fatigue. The archetype of the believer shows us that achieving this rational alternative requires immense personal courage, intellectual clarity, and decisive action in the face of deeply entrenched power.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. If we take this ancient rational framework seriously, it fundamentally changes how we evaluate the world around us right now.
It shifts the entire metric.
The true measure of a society isn't its technological advancement. It isn't the size of its GDP, the height of its skyscrapers, or the lofty ideologies it prints on its currency.
No, those are superficial.
The true measure of a civilization is simply this. Do its underlying structures allow any single human being to dominate, exploit, or hold arbitrary authority over another?
That's the ultimate test.
I want you to look at the power structures operating in your life today. Look at your local and national political systems. Look at the hierarchy in your workplace. Look at the mechanics of the global economy.
Take a really close look.
How many of these structures are genuinely operating on that pure, objective law of equity? And how many of them are just running on that second contradictory constitution?
The autocracy constitution.
Exactly. How many are just modern, polished, PR-friendly iterations of Pharaoh, Haman, and Korun, demanding that you accept a system where wealth and power are deliberately kept out of their proper place?